Hi everyone, and welcome back to Advanced Java. In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of including JSP files. This is the same as Lab 3-5, and it's also something that you'll be doing in your project. So I just want to highlight the instructions in the project that pertain to this section. So I'm just going to buzz down to the web application portion of the project. And you'll notice that on the various JSPs that get added, so here we've got the request data JSP page. When we take a look at the details for that, it says this page must use the same design as your site's index JSP page. So that same header and footer and menu, that type of stuff should be the same as your index page, and what should just change is the content. So this lab, I'm going to start us walking through the Lab 5, which says it'll be a directed lab. So this video, it represents that directed lab, and I'm just going to get you started. So the idea here, if we take a look at, for example, my page in the Java 112 application, I'm using this template. And the template has, a header. It's got some kind of navigation items here. We've got navigation on the right-hand side, and then a footer down here. So you can imagine that the various pieces of my web application would probably all have the same information, probably the same background, the same header, same navigation bar, right-hand side, and footer, and what would change is just kind of the main content here. So the dirty way to do this would be essentially copy that index JSP so that I've got all of this stuff, and then just find this location and change it. And then as I add a third page, do the same thing again. Copy that index page, make changes just to this portion. And hopefully you can see the problem with that approach. What happens if I need to add or change some navigation bar item, or I'm adding a new link into my Unit 3? Now I have all these different JSPs that I have to go into to make that change if I want the look and feel to be consistent. So if I make the change on index, I'm also going to have to make the change on the subsequent pages that I had originally copied from. So what we want to do is, rather than having all that duplicate code, if you will, spread over all those pages, is create a single JSP that just has, say, this top portion, the header. Put that in its own JSP. Put the navigation bar in its own JSP. Put maybe these chunks into their own JSP, or a single sidebar JSP, and same thing with the footer. And by including those, that means I can have that footer stuff in one JSP and include it everywhere that I need it. So if I need to make a change, maybe I'm updating my copyright or something as simple as that, I do it in one place, and that change will propagate across my entire site because I'm simply including that same JSP. So let's take a look at what all of that means, or how we actually accomplish that. Hopefully it makes sense where we're headed. Now the question is, how do we actually do that? So this is Lab 5, the template lab. So we'll start by breaking up that JSP into parts. The main kind of content, the menu, the header, head tag, footer, sidebar. This will vary a little bit depending on the layout of your page. So you may have exactly what's stated here, or maybe you'll have some additional items or even fewer. It just depends on what design you chose up front. So the lecture notes that go along with this are including files in JSP pages. And so this talks about that include directive that we took a look at in the team scripting exercise. The syntax for that is our angle bracket, percent, and then the @ which indicates it's a directive, the keyword include, and then we list the name of the file that we want to include. So that basically grabs that chunk or that file and plops it into the JSP that we're including it in. So it's a great way to kind of bring in the different pieces. What does that look like? Well, if we imagine that this was a very, very simple page that we had. So here we've got our HTML tag, open and closing, and we've got a head tag with a title in it. Inside our body, we've got a few different divs, and then our closing body tag and maybe a link here. So the different colored areas are the different chunks that we're going to split up and put into their own JSPs. So here's an example of actually doing that. So we would simply copy this portion, the opening head, closing head, and everything in between, and put that into a head tag JSP. Same thing with this div, which is a header block, a content block, a footer block, all of those chunks into their own JSPs. And then what we would end up with is now replace each of those chunks with the include directive and the file that was created. So here, for example, a head tag JSP, a header JSP, a content JSP. So in the end, this is what our JSP looks like. And really the changing part of the JSP would be in this content. And you can kind of think of this as a template then that I can use as I add additional pages. Everything here would stay the same. I would just put in a different content JSP here, which essentially then would be rendered in this area. That's the idea. One thing to be careful of here is that I've got some opening and closing tags here like HTML and body, and I was careful not to include those into my various chunks or my various JSPs. We don't want to open a tag in one included file and close it in another, because then that restricts us to having to use both of those JSPs and remember that they need to be used together. So if I, for example, put that HTML tag inside of this head tag, then I put the closing tag into the footer, I always have to remember, all right, I have to have those two pieces, and I may not want to do that. So it's a good idea, or a best practice, to always open and close tags in the same JSP. So in this case, HTML and body, I really can't split those up, so I'm just going to leave them right in sort of the root document here. And there's some examples here using exactly this stuff, so if you want to pull those in and practice with them, you can. What I'd like to do is actually start taking my current index and splitting that up, and hopefully you can kind of do that along with me for the first couple and then finish up the lab, and that's going to set you up for being ready to do this also in the project. So I'm just going to jump over into IntelliJ, and we'll split up, or we'll use our index JSP for this. So let's close up a few things here so we can kind of stay focused on what we're looking at. So here is my index JSP, and I'm going to make a copy of this. I realize I've got a version of it in GitHub, but that way, just in case I mess something up, I've got it right here handy, and I can kind of look at them side by side and make sure I've got all the pieces working. So I'm going to call this index before, meaning before templating, and I'm going to go ahead and just hang out of that. So that way I can render these two side by side in the browser to make sure that as I'm splitting things up, that I've done it correctly. So taking a look at the index here, I can think about some places where I probably will split this. So again, as I mentioned, I want to leave the HTML tag here in kind of that root document, so I'm going to leave that one alone. But here I've got a head, opening and closing tag. That's a great place to kind of split some stuff out. So I'm going to grab that and put that into a brand new JSP. So we'll go ahead and create a new file here. And we'll call this head.jsp. And I'll go ahead and paste that chunk in. I'm going to come back into my index.jsp, and where I just pulled that part out, now I want to use my include directive. So this is %% opening and closing at include file equals, and then the name of the JSP. And you can see the nice thing about IntelliJ is that it was doing some completion for me in terms of my different options. And there I can get some autocomplete. So that's one of the nice features of IntelliJ, being able to have some visibility into what the different files here are that I might include. All right, so this is, I haven't made many changes, but this is a good time to check it and make sure things are working before I start using this same pattern over and over in my application. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick deploy. And then let's head over to the browser and do a refresh here. And things are looking good. They're unchanged, and I could compare that side by side with the previous version. So that was Java 112, and I called that one indexbefore.jsp. So we've got that. They look the same. I can't even tell when I'm flipping between the two. So that means I'm good with that head portion. So now I can continue on doing that same thing. I'm going to leave the body tag because remember, I don't want to split up an opening and closing tag. So I'm going to leave that alone and now kind of start working through and determining, all right, what's going to make sense here for my next chunk? Probably this portion. So I've got an opening div, and I want to make sure that I'm getting all of those closing portions. So keep an eye on that as you go. On the right hand side, I've got that sidebar. I could put the entire sidebar here into one JSP, or I could break that down into maybe a JSP that has a sidebar, but then several JSPs within that have the particular unit. So if I wanted to kind of mix and match those for some reason on certain pages, that would allow me to manipulate that sidebar if I wanted to. So I could either, again, grab this as one big chunk or split that up into smaller pieces. So sidebar for unit 2, sidebar for unit 3. So you can make this as granular as you want to really be able to isolate that stuff and make it easy to change and update later on. All right, hopefully that gets you started. Again, this is a technique that you'll be using right in your project. So by converting the index over right away, that will help you set up for the project. I'm going to go ahead offline and finish up splitting this. So the code will be checked into GitHub if you want to take a look at that and review it there. I'll let you continue on your side. Please reach out with any questions. We'll see you next time.